So we're going to be talking about the party ideologies that are currently in Europe, alive in Europe, and there's 7 of them. You see them here on the two-dimensional screen with the 2 dimensions of political conflict: economic left to economic right, and Gal to Tan, the social-cultural dimension. And we're going to split this in 2 videos. So this time we're going to talk about the 4 main party families that all developed in the 19th century, starting with the Social Democrats, Christian Democrats, Conservatives to the Liberals. And in the next video we'll pick up the remaining 3 that are a little younger in the teeth: Radical Left, Greens and Tan parties. So let's get started. We're going to each time try to set this a bit in historical context and then talk about the core values.
So let's get started with social democracy. And you can really conceive of the 20th century as the century of social democracy, because this was the century in which the working class, the massive industrial workers who were mobilized in the context of the Industrial Revolution. And so you had the development of factories, a new kind of production, factory workers, people who were mostly in the cities or larger towns, and who felt themselves to be exploited. They had a very harsh life. The age expectancy of a person born in Liverpool in 1830 was 19 years of age, and I expect that many of you watching this would be around that age. That was the average life expectancy. But more than that, there was no safety net. If you lost your job, you were thrust to the edge of existence. There was no welfare, there was no old age pensions. It was a very hard life. And the first response of many workers was Luddism, and that was machine breaking. And eventually that fizzled out, and then there were 2 main kind of strands, 2 main avenues by which workers were mobilized. And the first of those was trade unions. And trade unions are combinations of workers in a particular industry or particular factory, where they get some kind of leverage over their lives, over the way in which they're paid, the extent to which they're paid, the conditions under which they work, by combining together and saying to the employer, look, if our demands are not met, we're not going to work for you. And that was a combination. At first these were illegal. I mean, they were illegal in the United States, they were illegal in Britain, they were illegal in all of the industrializing countries. But by the mid-19th century, they became legal in the United States and in Britain. So that was the one strand. And then the other strand was the political strand. And that was the political party, the socialist parties, later social democratic parties. And these 2 were very closely tied together. In Britain, for example, the unions came first. Their unions were already set up in the 1850s. And it took quite a few decades before those unions decided that they wanted some voice in the political realm. And they created the Labour Party. That was actually in 1900.
It's interesting, the name, Labour Party, right? Because we often think of these parties as socialist parties or Marxist parties, but the name for the British party is the Labour Party. And does that have to do with the role of the trade unions, the central role in that?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, essentially what the Labour Party wanted in the early days was to get more workers into Parliament. They actually wanted representation within the existing structure of the society. But in many societies, particularly authoritarian societies, but some other societies besides, the socialists were dominated by intellectuals who wanted a revolution in the society itself. And what they wanted was to end what they believed to be economic exploitation by getting rid of the system of wage labour. So there was always this tension between the workers in the unions, who often wanted practical steps, more wages, a bit more pay, an extra $1 a day, and the party, who were often more intellectually oriented and who were often more ambitious in their goals for social change.
Now, nowadays, many of these formerly socialist parties don't call themselves that anymore. They call themselves social democratic. And does that have to do with a sort of mellowing of their ideology in the past decades?
But I haven't mentioned the United States yet.
Oh, yes, okay.
And in the United States, it was interesting, the socialists failed to create a stable party that could actually be one of the major political parties. And one of the reasons for that was that the party was so distinct, actually opposed to the unions. The unions were led by Samuel Gompers. He was the president of the American Federation of Labor until the mid-1920s. Eugene Debs was the 5-time presidential candidate of the Socialist Party, and he had such different views. He felt that the union activities were actually irrelevant because they could never really get any basic change in the society. And so he took a very revolutionary path. And there was this gap between the unions and the Socialist Party, and the Socialist Party never had the base in a large organisation such as they had in most European countries. It was this disjuncture, this debate, disagreement between the unions and the Socialist Party that I think is one of the fundamental. Actually, I've written a book about this called Why it didn't happen here, why socialism failed in the United States, which picks up on this theme and looks at some of the other reasons why there was no stable, durable, effective socialist party. That is, until Bernie Sanders, who raised this in the presidential debates and contests for the in the primaries, and in the last election and in the current election. But you're right. I mean, social democracy became more moderate after World War II, and the challenge for social democrats was to try to create the basis for a effective, prosperous society in which workers could have health security, in which they could actually have health coverage under all circumstances, universal health care, in which education would be very broadly available, both secondary and tertiary, alongside primary.
So essentially, the worker movement had accepted, by and large, capitalism as a system.
They had accepted capitalism as a system, and what they wanted to do was get benefits within that. Yeah. And the feeling was that in a liberal democracy, workers could gain representation, and they could have an effective voice and win elections under the banner of social democracy. They could institute progressive taxation, where the people, richer people who benefited from the institutions of the society, from the education of the society, from the rules of the society, would pay a larger share of their earnings, of their income, into the pot, and that could go to the less well-off people, and in which the Socialist Party, the Social Democratic Party, could play an active role in the management of the economy, so that in a recession or a depression, the government could step in and sustain aggregate demand. And that was called Keynesian. John Maynard Keynes, the British economist, interwar economist, Keynesian economic management.
Also underlying a lot of the Roosevelt's policies, the New Deal policies.
Yes,
right?
And in the United States, the New Deal, which was an attempt by the state to come in and supplement, not replace the market, but supplement the market in a time of depression.
Now, the Social Democratic Party family is, in Europe, probably the most uniformly spread across Europe. I think there is no country that has no social democratic or socialist party. Sometimes they call themselves that way in Europe. So the United States, in that respect, really is an exception, right? It
really is an exception. And across Europe, I mean, the Social Democrats are the only party family, as you mentioned, to be present as a major party in every country.
Yeah. So why don't you take a minute now to look at the following slide and this slide, and what you think are the 2 or 3 issues that are the most important for social democratic parties. Of course, feel free to use the pause button if you'd like a little bit more time. And then when you're ready, The answer will be on the next slide.
Well, here is the overarching view of political parties across Europe, and we will now turn to the Christian Democrats. So the Social Democrats are on the economic left and Gal. The Christian Democrats are kind of the alter ego of the Social Democrats. They're on the tan side, not enormously tan, but on the tan side, and on the right, economic right side, not enormously economic right, as Liesbet will explain, but on the right side in contrast to the Social Democrats.
Yes, the Christian Democratic Party family has its roots actually just like social democracy in the 19th century, if you want even a little earlier. It was at first a defensive move against two major big processes. One was the French Revolution, which was riding on enlightenment and the idea of popular sovereignty, which was in tension with the older notion embedded in the church, particularly the Catholic Church, that the teachings of the church were providing the guidance that people needed to lead their lives. So, and the idea of popular sovereignty is, of course, that people by themselves and within themselves can find the guidance to determine their personal life and also participate in public life. So that was one, a reaction against enlightenment and the idea of popular sovereignty. But perhaps as important, maybe even more important, was at first the reluctance to embrace industrialization, industrialism, and what that did for the society, that according to traditional Catholic teachings was a organism that was whole and solidary. The notion of solidarity was deeply embedded in religious beliefs, Catholicism, but also many Protestant strands. And what industrialism did, as Gary was mentioning when he talked about social democracy, it just generated deep, deep divisions in the society and big conflict, class conflict. And socialist parties, less so social democracy, embraced this class struggle as an essential element of life, and one could choose a side in this. For Christian democracy or for Catholicism, the earlier version of it, this was very difficult to deal with, and so there was a pushback against this notion that society was divided. Out of that came, after rejection, came an acceptance that the course of history was going to be one of deeper or broadening democracy. And then, just as social democracy had to make a choice about whether it was going to accept capitalism as a system, Christian democracy had to decide whether it was going to accept democracy and mass democracy and a modern society as just a way of life, and how to place themselves and what that would do for the kind of beliefs, the religion as a guiding principle for policy, what that would do for people who continue to care about religion. And then came in the 20th century some additional shocks, World War II, and then after that secularization, the increasing unmooring of people from a religious life. World War II and the most, particularly Catholic, but also Protestant parties and party adherents resisted Nazism, and in that experience of fighting Nazism, they discovered that there was probably more they had in common with others who were fighting Nazism, including communists, but certainly also people of other belief systems, than what divided them. And that led to a kind of a realization that, living in one's niche, of a Catholic niche or a Protestant niche or a secular niche, was perhaps not the most useful way for embracing a movement that could acquire power.
Yes, because in the 1930s, and before, Catholics were kind of when they were a minority, as they were in Germany, which was the big country for Catholic-Protestant relations, Catholics were subject to exploitation. They were suppressed by Bismarck, and they formed a party that was called Das Centrum, the Centre Party, which was like a hedgehog party. And that hedgehog party was really, didn't conceive itself as a source of government of the society as a whole. And then after World War II, they changed. And as you're going to say, they became interdenominational.
Exactly.
They actually encompassed Protestants as well as Catholics, and became the largest party in German elections from 1949, the first election after World War II. So it was a total kind of sea change in the way in which Christian Democrats conceived the party and their role in society.
It was perhaps most dramatic in Germany, maybe perhaps because the experience of Nazism and so forth was so dramatic, obviously, there. But it also was, happened in the Netherlands, it happened in Belgium, it happened in Italy to some extent, and other countries that had Christian democratic parties. The other thing that happened as of the 1960s was, as I mentioned, secularization. That is, religion became a less central part of
people
many
stopped going to
people's
church.
lives. The simple thing is people stopped going to church.
Yes, fewer people went to church.
Yeah, and it put formerly religious parties for a choice. Either you stick to the original thing, that religion is the guiding and perhaps the dominant principle, or you open up and you become a little looser with the role of religion. You don't necessarily abandon it, but the role of religion as a principle for public policy becomes one of several. And the broader set of principles then becomes those of more traditional values, conservative values, traditional motherhood, anti-euthanasia, or reluctant to embrace euthanasia, or anti-abortion.
Yes. So they're pro the welfare state.
Yes.
In favour of progressive taxes. So, you can think of Christian Democrats in Europe as like Republicans, but softer. In terms of their religious effect. So what you don't hear, for example, someone like Angela Merkel talking about how God guides her decisions, or how she's speaking in the name of God, or how she actually understands what God would want in this situation. So it's much more sotto voce, much more softly spoken. And as you're saying, the Christian Democrats are not as right-wing economically as the Republicans.
And that has a link with the earlier idea of solidarity that I mentioned, right? That and in a concrete version, this led the early Christian Democratic and Catholic parties and Protestant parties to actually set up trade unions in the late 19th century that were explicitly competing with trade unions set up by the socialists.
Yeah. So they had a working class wing, which is interesting.
Exactly. Which was in some countries like Germany and Belgium are actually pretty powerful inside the party.
So, generally speaking in Europe, Christian Democrats are not across the board. Where you get conservative parties, you don't get Christian Democratic parties. It's one or the other. So in Britain there's a Conservative Party, not a Christian Democratic Party. But you get a strong Christian Democratic representation in Germany. It's been the predominant party after World War II.
And given Germany's role in Europe, its big economic and also a political role, that's a key component in understanding European politics.
You get them in the Netherlands, Belgium, Austria, Ireland and Poland. Yeah. These are traditionally Catholic societies, or societies in which Catholics have a significant share of the population, a minority in the Netherlands, but a majority in the remaining societies where you find Christian Democratic parties.
Yes.
Well, why don't you take a minute now to look at the slide in front of you, and what do you think, as before, what are the 2 or 3 issues, major issues, that are the most important for Christian Democratic parties? And you can use the pause button while you think about your answer, and when you're ready, the answers are on the following slide.
Well, Okay, if you got 2 or 3 correct answers, well done. And let's now go to the close in terms of ideological location, the Conservatives, as you can see, close to the Christian Democrats. So let's see what are some similarities and what are some differences between Conservatives and the Christian Democrats.
I think conservatism is fascinating, and it has these
Particularly as
two,
a Brit.
particularly as a Brit, because conservatism actually has its origin in Britain,
Yeah.
and particularly in the works of someone you may have heard of, Edmund Burke, in the late 18th century, and he had his conception of conservatism was conservatism with a small c. That is to conserve. It wasn't to block change. It wasn't to. He realised that if you block change, you might actually lead to revolution. You had to adjust the society and its institutions to new things that came along. It had to adapt. But adapt is very different from whole-scale reform. His conception of society was as a complex organism, a kind of an interrelated set of institutions in which the individuals also were interrelated. They were rooted in tradition. His idea was, look, if an institution is around now, it served a purpose, and we should be attentive to that purpose. So, to use the kind of image of going to a doctor, if you go to the doctor with a pain, there's a problem, say, in your hand, the doctor is very unlikely to turn around and say, well, Mr. Marks, your hand is not functional, we're going to create a new one for you. You do that only in absolute extremis. So his criticism of the French Revolution was that the French revolutions were operating as if they were operating on what he described as a carte blanche, as if they were operating on a scene in which they could create people from the beginning, to create a new man, a new woman, to create new institutions. He believed that was the way, it was an evil approach to politics. So this term reciprocity is a key to Burke's conception of conservatism. Reciprocity is an important concept. It means that individuals have relations with other individuals for which they are responsible. We're not isolated individuals in the society, but we have relations with each other in which we have a responsibility to care for others in our society. And a particular application of that is this interesting term, noblesse oblige, noblesse oblige. And it means the obligation of somebody who is an elite, who's a noble, who's a landed magnate, the feudal aristocracy, to care for those in their community. It's an idea of society as a community. And in feudal relations, it had the aspect of, well, the peasant would work for 1/10 of their time on the noble's lands, and the noble would provide security for the peasants. And it was an application of that kind of principle of reciprocity to the society as a whole. And it gets expressed in the foundation of the Conservative Party. So Benjamin Disraeli, you could look this person up in Google, a very interesting and unusual person, who was actually born as a Jew. His father converted, and Benjamin Disraeli, I think it was when he was 8 years old, converted to Christianity. An unusual person to found conservatism. His idea was he founded the Conservative Party, and he wrote a book called Sybil, and it was about the two nations, and it was a critique of the two nations. I'm talking about the second half of the 19th century, that Britain was two nations, the rich and the poor, and that was fundamentally bad, and we had to overcome those social divisions to create a more cohesive society in which there would be greater reciprocity among the individuals in that society.
So I think you can sort of sense the similarity in fundamental outlook between the traditional Christian democracy and the traditional conservatism. The idea of a society as a whole with a natural order, a hierarchy, but one that implies reciprocal obligations. You know, if you are higher in the hierarchy, you are also expected to care for the ones who depend upon you.
Yes.
Right?
And that's so different from the second strand. So that's the first strand, the traditional strand in conservatism. And then there's contemporary conservatism, introduced in Britain by Margaret Thatcher, Maggie Thatcher, the great Prime Minister, which conceived of society. She said there is no society, it is the individuals. Yes. And it's only the individuals, there's nothing in society beyond the individuals. And so this was, in Britain, what we call neoliberalism. Remember that distinction between liberalism in the American meaning and liberalism in the European meaning. And it was liberalism, that is, a market conception of society. And British conservatism is this tension between these two strands of conservatism.
So, and what also goes with that newer version of conservatism is a stronger foundation in nationalism.
Absolutely. It is the conception of society and a kind of a very strong patriotism or even nationalism.
Yes.
That you find, say, in the great French conservative. Can you think of the great French conservative of the post-Second World War era, Charles de Gaulle? Indeed. Nationalism was at the core of his ideology.
Indeed. Which brings us to conservatism is probably more widespread than Christian democracy in today's Europe. So the key countries, of course, is Britain, that's one, Edmund Burke's ground, Margaret Thatcher's soil. But then France with the Gaullists, Charles de Gaulle, and the current version of this Les Républicains, which is the contemporary Gaullist party. But also countries like Sweden, Swedish moderates, or Spain, where you might expect in a Catholic country Christian democracy to be the dominant force, but it's actually a party that calls itself and identifies explicitly with conservatism. And in that party, for example, you see some of the key values very clearly represented. Traditional values, traditionalism in terms of social values, and nationalism or patriotism, a strong emphasis on the coherence and the importance of the nation. But you also have conservative parties in most East European countries.
Well, why don't you, as we've done before, why don't you take a minute now to look at this slide and what do you think are the 2 or 3 issues that are most important for conservative parties? And again, you can use the pause button if you'd like a little bit more time to think about your answer. And when you're ready, the answers are on the next slide in green and orange.